Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those bizarre moments in history that you probably won't survive if you ever find yourself in a time machine. The Roman emperor who actually tried to ban flatulence. I know, right? You can already feel your cheeks tingling in anticipation. It's a tale filled with a mix of absurdity and a whole lot of power. After all, what does it take for an emperor to think he can regulate bodily functions? Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for him. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'll wait. Also, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always interesting to see where in the world people are tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with an emperor who, it turns out, might not have had the best grasp on reality. This wasn't your typical ruler with a heavy hand in military campaigns or constructing monumental buildings. Oh no, this emperor had a very different focus. He was, let's say, a bit obsessed with controlling the smallest details of his empire, one of them being the sounds and smells coming from his people. You're probably wondering what could possibly go so wrong that someone would need to control something as natural as flatulence? Well, buckle in. It's a journey that might make you rethink your position on silent but deadly moments in life. But before we go any further, let me set the scene. Rome, the 4th century. The city was bursting with energy, its people constantly bustling about, always up to something. The markets were lively, the senators bickering, and the gladiators, well, they were probably too busy with their swords to care about any of this. But in the midst of all this, Emperor Elagabalus, a rather peculiar figure, had an idea that would soon make him infamous in the annals of history. Emperor Elagabalus was not your typical Roman ruler. He came to power as a teenager and was known for his erratic behavior, outlandish antics, and a particular obsession with, of all things, religious rituals. Historians still argue whether he was genuinely eccentric or just a bit too caught up in his own sense of power. Either way, it was clear he wasn't exactly a business-as-usual kind of guy. No, Elagabalus would rather toss out centuries of tradition and replace them with, well, something more interesting. He replaced the traditional gods of Rome with his own deity, the Syrian sun god Elgabal, and had grand plans to make this foreign god the center of Roman worship. Let's just say the old Roman gods weren't thrilled about that. Now, what does this have to do with flatulence? Well, Elagabalus, in all his eccentricity, apparently decided that one of the natural bodily functions of his people, yes, flatulence, needed regulation. It was as if the emperor thought that his control over the divine and political spheres should extend to the most personal aspects of Roman life. And why not? If he could dictate who worshipped what gods, why not dictate when and where someone could let out a little gas? It sounds absolutely absurd, but the Roman Empire, at its peak, was a place where even the strangest ideas could gain traction. So, Elagabalus issued a decree that punishments would be levied on those who passed gas in public spaces. Yes, you heard that right. If you were caught letting one rip in the streets of Rome, you could face a fine or even more severe penalties. You can almost hear the collective gasp, pun intended, of the people. Surely, no one could have imagined that something so natural, so human, could be controlled like this. Historians still argue whether this law was ever actually enforced or whether it was just a whimsical piece of legislation to further showcase Elagabalus's grasp on power. After all, Rome was a city that valued decorum and order, and passing gas in public was certainly a breach of that. But was it really worth the emperor's time to make this a law? Some scholars think it was just another instance of Elagabalus trying to make a spectacle of himself. Perhaps it was his attempt to be taken seriously in a world that already had its fair share of absurd leaders. But the law wasn't just about flatulence. Oh no, it was about control over something as base as bodily functions, a reminder that even the most mundane parts of life could be ruled by the emperor. In fact, this move to regulate such a basic bodily function was part of a larger pattern in Elagabalus's reign. He was obsessed with controlling every little detail of his people's lives, from their religious practices to their public behavior. Flatulence laws might have been the most bizarre of his rulings, but they certainly weren't the only ones. The scene is set. Emperor Elagabalus, not content with just being the ruler of an empire, had essentially become the self-appointed director of every single detail of Roman life. If he could, he would have probably even regulated the way you took your morning bath. But the thing about Elagabalus was that he wasn't only about the grand, divine gestures. No, he also had a way of making his power felt in the most personal and trivial aspects of life, like, well, when you could let out a fart. What is it about some emperors that just feel the need to control everything? Historians still argue whether the emperor's oddball decrees were intended as a statement of his power, or if he genuinely believed in their necessity. Maybe it was a bit of both. But whatever his reasoning, it's clear that Elagabalus had a particular flair for the dramatic. Take, for example, the way he made grand public shows of his divine status. These weren't just any religious ceremonies. Elagabalus would often orchestrate some of the most outlandish rituals, ones that involved extravagant processions, the strangest sacrifices, and all sorts of religious symbols meant to display his unique relationship with the gods. But even though his religious antics were extravagant, it was his everyday decrees that seemed to capture the attention of his people. The law against public flatulence was just one of many ways Elagabalus demonstrated his power over the mundane, but the absurdity of it left a lasting impression. It's easy to imagine Romans grumbling about the emperor's latest decree as they made their way through the marketplace, now unsure of whether or not they could release a little gas in peace. Were they really going to be fined for doing something that had absolutely nothing to do with the empire's prosperity or military strength? Felt like a joke, except that, in this case, the joke was on them. The most famous story surrounding Elagabalus's reign involves his attempt to further assert his status as the divine ruler of Rome by holding an extravagant banquet where guests were showered in roses, literally. It was said that Elagabalus had so many roses thrown at the partygoers that they suffocated under the weight of the petals. The act wasn't just an eccentric gesture, it was a reminder to his subjects of how deeply he was intertwined with the divine, how he could twist the very nature of things, like roses, into something that could either bless or overwhelm you. Historians still argue whether these outlandish events were signs of a deeply religious man, one who sought to connect the people to his divine power, or whether they were simply symptoms of someone desperate to be taken seriously as a ruler. Either way, it was clear Elagabalus was not one to shy away from spectacle. He was the emperor who dared to dictate the most intimate, uncontrollable part of the human experience, the part where your body simply does what it's meant to do without asking permission. And while the rose-saturated banquets may have earned him some notoriety, it was his attempts to micromanage the mundane aspects of life that would become his legacy, just, perhaps, not the kind of legacy he had in mind. And then, of course, there's the question of whether the public actually went along with it. Would people really obey such a ridiculous law? Were there actual reports of fines being levied for passing gas in public? Most sources suggest that the emperor's bizarre decrees were not always enforced with the kind of strictness he might have wanted. After all, it's hard to imagine a Roman guard stepping up to someone in the middle of a crowded marketplace and asking for their identification because they'd let out a loud fart. It would have been a farce, a scene that would have made even the most disciplined legionnaire snicker. However, one has to wonder, if you were living under Elagabalus's reign, would you have risked the potential punishment? The emperor wasn't exactly known for being lenient with those who defied him. So, perhaps there was a small army of Romans who, ever vigilant, clutched their stomachs a little tighter, checking their surroundings for guards or spies before daring to let one slip. A society that could regulate such a trivial thing also had a way of making people fear even the smallest infraction. You never knew when a new decree would come down the pike, one that might start as a joke and end up as an unspoken rule that everyone was too afraid to break. Historians still argue about how serious Elagabalus was with his control over bodily functions. Was the law a satirical attempt to further demonstrate the emperor's eccentricity? Or did he genuinely believe that public flatulence was a threat to his rule? We'll never truly know, but what we do know is that his reign was marked by an endless series of bizarre laws, rituals, and performances that were less about ruling an empire and more about creating a world where Elagabalus himself could be the center of attention, no matter how ridiculous it might get. The emperor's approach to ruling, however, didn't just end with flatulence laws and flower-laden banquets. He was known for extravagant displays of his power, especially when it came to his lavish tastes. He had a fondness for luxury and excess that would have made even the wealthiest Roman aristocrats blink twice. Gold, pearls, exotic animals, Elagabalus had them all. His love of indulgence was a key part of his reign, and it's likely that his pursuit of the finest things in life mirrored his approach to power, an endless quest for grandeur, no matter the cost. It's here that Elagabalus's story gets even stranger. While the emperor certainly had his share of wealth, it was clear he didn't exactly use it in a way that would endear him to the Senate or the common people. In fact, many considered him to be reckless and wasteful, spending exorbitant amounts of money on frivolous luxuries, while the empire itself faced numerous problems, from financial instability to military unrest. The people who lived under his rule weren't too thrilled with his antics. You can almost hear their grumbles. "We're starving, and the emperor is throwing rose petals at us? What kind of emperor is this?" The controversy surrounding Elagabalus was not just about his eccentricities, though, as you can imagine, in a time when Rome's mighty empire was struggling to maintain its strength, an emperor who seemed more focused on his own whims than on the welfare of the state wasn't exactly a fan favorite. Despite all the flamboyant shows, the lavish banquets, and yes, the laws about public flatulence, Elagabalus's reign was marked by a profound disconnection from the core of Roman leadership, the Senate. To understand why this emperor's eccentricities were more than just amusing anecdotes, we need to look deeper into the dynamics of Roman power and politics. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's reign was a series of mistakes driven by personal excess, or if his disregard for Roman tradition was a deliberate attempt to redefine the concept of power itself. One thing that was unmistakable, though, was his disregard for Roman political norms. Roman emperors traditionally held a delicate balance with the Senate, that body of senators who wielded tremendous influence. It was the Senate that, in many ways, shaped the political life of Rome and represented the ideals of Roman civilization. So when Elagabalus became emperor, his actions, his refusal to respect the traditions of Roman politics, immediately raised eyebrows. Take his attitude toward the Senate, for example. Elagabalus's behavior was not exactly what one might call statesmanlike. Rather than working with the Senate, he openly mocked it, ridiculing its role in government and treating its members like pawns in his bizarre personal game. This tension between the emperor and the Senate didn't just make for awkward dinners. It created real political instability. You see, the Senate was still a powerful body that could make life difficult for an emperor. While it might not have had the same military might as the emperor's legions, it had influence, connections, and the ability to sway public opinion. Elagabalus, however, wasn't one to care much for political stability. Instead of respecting the Senate's authority or seeking to form alliances with powerful Roman families, he alienated them. His actions often came across as an attempt to elevate his own personal authority above anything else, including the government institutions that had held Rome together for centuries. It was as if he wanted to be the living embodiment of Roman power, with no room for anyone else. To make matters worse, he surrounded himself with sycophants and advisors who were either too afraid or too loyal to speak up, further isolating him from the political forces that had shaped Rome's rise. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's disregard for tradition was rooted in a genuine belief that the old Roman ways were outdated, or whether it was the result of a ruler who had been so isolated in his own fantasies of grandeur that he simply couldn't recognize the consequences of his actions. Whatever the reason, Elagabalus's isolation from the Senate and Roman tradition eventually contributed to his downfall. His eccentric laws, his lavish lifestyle, and his lack of political foresight made him a target for those who were disillusioned by his reign. But it wasn't just the Senate that took issue with Elagabalus. The military, always a crucial pillar of Roman power, was also growing increasingly discontented. This, of course, was a problem because emperors weren't just rulers. They were military leaders. They needed the loyalty of the army to maintain control of the empire. Elagabalus, however, seemed more interested in playing with religious rituals and indulging in luxury than in tending to the concerns of the soldiers who helped secure Rome's borders. As you can imagine, this was a recipe for disaster. The Roman military was known for being fiercely loyal to its emperor, but only as long as that emperor could deliver on promises of security, stability, and, crucially, pay. Soldiers needed to be paid, and they needed to feel as though their emperor understood the pressures of the military life. Elagabalus's lack of interest in the welfare of the soldiers, combined with his disregard for Roman military traditions, led to a growing sense of dissatisfaction among the ranks. In fact, it wasn't long before the military's discontent became a significant threat to Elagabalus's rule. Historians still argue whether the emperor was simply too disconnected from reality to understand the gravity of the situation, or if he truly believed that his divine status could shield him from any consequences. Regardless, it wasn't long before the military rebellion came. The army, tired of Elagabalus's frivolous leadership, eventually turned against him. A group of high-ranking officers, alongside some disgruntled soldiers, seized the moment and had the emperor assassinated. His reign was over, but his bizarre legacy would live on in the strange tales of his eccentricities. It's hard not to wonder what Elagabalus was thinking in his final moments. Did he believe that his extravagant lifestyle and indulgences had made him invincible? Did he think his divine connection to the gods would somehow protect him from the wrath of the people? It's a question that historians still debate, and it's one of the many mysteries that surround his reign. What we do know is that Elagabalus's fall from power was swift and brutal, a stark reminder of the consequences of alienating both the political and military power structures that were the backbone of Rome's empire. But even after his death, Elagabalus's strange legacy lingered. The stories about his eccentricities continued to circulate, with each retelling adding more layers of absurdity. He became the stuff of legend, an emperor who tried to ban farts, a ruler who sought to control the most natural aspects of human life. Even today, his reign is remembered not for the strength or glory of the Roman Empire, but for its bizarre, almost comical excesses. And maybe that's the way he'd like to be remembered, a ruler whose personality was as much a part of Roman history as the empire itself. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's reign was a tragic failure of leadership or simply a moment of excess in an empire that was slowly crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. One thing, however, is certain. His story is a reminder that sometimes, no matter how powerful or eccentric a ruler might be, they're never truly untouchable. After Elagabalus's assassination, his reign was swiftly erased from Rome's collective memory. The Senate, ever eager to distance itself from the scandalous years of his rule, declared damnatio memoriae, meaning they condemned the memory of Elagabalus. His statues were torn down, his name was erased from inscriptions, and any trace of his rule was carefully scrubbed from Roman history. The emperor was, in essence, unmade. This decision wasn't entirely unexpected. You see, in ancient Rome, an emperor's reputation was not just a matter of pride. It was a matter of divine favor. A ruler who lost the support of both the Senate and the people could find himself in an extraordinarily precarious position, and Elagabalus had undoubtedly fallen out of favor. His eccentricities, his complete disregard for tradition, and his alienation of the Senate and military had left him vulnerable. His very memory was erased to ensure that his reign would never be associated with the greatness of Rome. But let's take a moment to reflect on the curious nature of memory in the ancient world. Historians still argue whether the Senate's swift condemnation of Elagabalus was primarily politically motivated or a reflection of genuine disapproval of his actions. After all, the Roman Senate was an institution steeped in power and tradition, and Elagabalus had dared to challenge both. His rule had been marked by an almost reckless defiance of Roman norms, and in a society that valued stability and order above all else, his disregard for the established rules could not go unchecked. The problem was that, while the Senate could erase the emperor's name from official records, they couldn't erase the stories. The bizarre tales of Elagabalus's reign would continue to be told, passed down by the people, sometimes with embellishments, sometimes with humor, and sometimes with genuine disbelief. The eccentric emperor's influence on Roman culture wasn't so easily erased, no matter how hard the Senate tried. Historians still debate the true extent of Elagabalus's excesses. Were they as outrageous as later accounts suggest? Or were they exaggerated by writers who found his reign too absurd to be true? After all, the ancient Roman writers weren't exactly neutral observers. They had their own biases, especially when it came to writing about emperors who fell from favor. Some sources paint Elagabalus as a decadent, power-mad ruler whose every action was a testament to his wild disregard for Roman customs. Others, however, suggest that his eccentricities may have been overstated, or that he was simply a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Despite this, the stories about Elagabalus continued to thrive. He became, in many ways, a symbol of the excesses of imperial power. To later generations, his reign was not a period of military conquests or political stability, but a time when the emperor's personal whims and bizarre rituals took precedence over the welfare of the empire. And as absurd as it may seem, there's something oddly fascinating about the idea that one of Rome's emperors sought to control something as mundane as flatulence. But Elagabalus wasn't the only emperor whose reign was remembered more for its peculiarities than its achievements. His story is part of a larger tradition of emperors whose names have become synonymous with excess, corruption, and decadence. In a way, Elagabalus's reign was a warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of ignoring tradition. And yet, despite all the ridicule, there's a strange sense of admiration for his audacity, for his willingness to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in Roman society. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's eccentricities were a sign of his genius or a reflection of a deeply unstable mind. Some suggest that his behavior was an expression of divine will, a belief that he was destined to rule with absolute authority, regardless of the consequences. Others see his reign as a symptom of the larger decay within the Roman Empire, a sign that the empire's foundations were slowly crumbling under the weight of its own imperial ambitions. Regardless of how we interpret Elagabalus's actions, one thing is clear. His reign, while short and marked by scandal, left an indelible mark on Roman history. His name may have been erased, but the stories of his excesses, his bizarre laws, and his personal quirks would continue to be told long after his death. And even now, all these centuries later, Elagabalus's name still stirs up intrigue and curiosity. There's something about the emperor's audacity, his willingness to break all the rules, that captures the imagination. Even though his reign was marked by chaos, his defiance of tradition, and his strange laws, Elagabalus stands as a symbol of the complexity of Roman leadership. For all the excess and eccentricity, his reign also reveals something deeper about the nature of power, authority, and the ways in which the Roman Empire struggled to maintain its dominance. In the end, Elagabalus may not have been a great emperor in the traditional sense. He didn't conquer new lands, expand the empire, or bring peace to Rome. But he did leave a lasting legacy, not through military victories or political reforms, but through the very absurdity of his reign. And perhaps that's what makes his story so fascinating, because it reminds us that even the most bizarre, ridiculous chapters in history can be the ones that endure the longest. Now, imagine yourself in the heart of Rome during the reign of Elagabalus. The city is buzzing with rumors, whispers, and incredulity. People on the streets might have heard the latest stories about their emperor. Perhaps his odd laws, his extravagant rituals, or his plans to marry a Vestal virgin. Some would laugh it off as nonsense, while others would nod sagely, convinced that this was just the latest sign of the empire's decline. But behind the chatter, there was a deeper question. Was Elagabalus really just a product of his time, or was he a symptom of something much larger at play? Historians still debate whether Elagabalus was a truly unique figure, or whether his eccentricities were simply amplified by the chaotic period in which he ruled. After all, the 3rd century was a tumultuous time for the Roman Empire. It was a period marked by instability, civil wars, and constant threats from outside forces. Rome was struggling to hold onto its power, and in such an environment, the lines between eccentricity and insanity could easily blur. What makes Elagabalus's reign stand out, however, is the sheer audacity of his behavior. He didn't just rule with a heavy hand. He sought to remake Roman society in his image. His attempt to impose his own version of the divine upon the empire, for example, was one of the more dramatic examples of his disregard for tradition. The worship of Elagabal, the sun god from his homeland of Emesa, was one of the central pillars of his rule. He built a massive temple to the god, and the rituals surrounding Elagabalus' worship were unlike anything seen in Rome before. This was no quiet, peaceful religion. Elagabalus's followers were expected to engage in wild, frenzied ceremonies, often involving music, dancing, and even human sacrifice. But his attempts to turn Rome into the center of this new religious cult didn't sit well with the Senate or the people. Many saw it as a dangerous experiment, a foreign imposition that threatened the very fabric of Roman religious tradition. It wasn't just that Elagabalus was unorthodox. It was that he was willing to elevate a foreign god to the highest position in Roman religious life. In a city where the state religion was deeply tied to the identity of the empire, such a bold move was bound to raise eyebrows and provoke backlash. Now, we should take a moment to consider just how much religion and politics were intertwined in ancient Rome. The two weren't separate realms as they might seem today. A ruler's religious beliefs, or, in some cases, their choice to impose a foreign religion, were seen as a reflection of their character and their ability to lead. If the emperor could not navigate the complex religious landscape of Rome, how could they manage the empire? Elagabalus's decision to make the sun god his personal patron was not only a challenge to Roman traditions but also a serious political gamble. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's attempts to impose his religion were driven by personal belief or by a desire to consolidate power. Was he a deeply spiritual man who saw himself as the divine representative of Elagabalus? Or was he simply playing the game of politics, using the power of the sun god to elevate his status and authority? Some modern scholars suggest that Elagabalus was a true believer, convinced that his god was the one true deity. Others point to the emperor's extreme behavior and question whether he really believed in anything beyond his own desires. One thing is for sure: Elagabalus's religious reforms were deeply unpopular. The Senate, which had already been alienated by his eccentric behavior, was particularly hostile to his religious ambitions. When the emperor introduced Elagabalus' cult to Rome, it was seen as a direct challenge to the Roman gods and their traditional rituals. To many, this was a step too far, a sign that Elagabalus was more concerned with his own whims than the well-being of the empire. What makes this situation even more complex is that Elagabalus was not entirely without allies. His religious reforms did have their supporters, particularly among the people of Emesa, where Elagabalus had been born. These supporters saw the emperor as a divine figure, sent by the gods to bring a new era of prosperity and spiritual enlightenment. To them, Elagabalus's eccentricities were signs of his divine nature, not evidence of his instability. Historians still debate how much influence these supporters had on Elagabalus's decisions. Was he truly surrounded by a group of loyalists who encouraged his eccentric behavior, or was he simply too isolated to see the larger picture? It's possible that Elagabalus, for all his peculiarities, was genuinely trying to restore the empire's greatness by elevating a god he believed could guide Rome to victory. Whether or not he succeeded is another question entirely. But for those who opposed him, Elagabalus was a tyrant, a ruler who had lost touch with the traditions that made Rome great. His religious reforms were seen as a direct assault on the identity of the empire, and they were just one of the many factors that led to his downfall. When he was finally assassinated, it wasn't just his eccentricities that led to his death. It was the growing realization that he had alienated too many powerful factions in Roman society. His death marked the end of an era of extreme decadence, but his reign remains an important chapter in the history of Rome. His attempts to impose his own brand of religious orthodoxy and his eccentric policies may seem outlandish today, but they were a reflection of the chaotic times in which he lived. The Roman Empire, struggling to maintain its power, was in desperate need of stability, and Elagabalus's behavior, strange as it was an expression of the larger forces at play. So, as we reflect on Elagabalus's reign, we're left with a curious question. Did his bizarre acts of flatulence control, his wild religious reforms, and his strange decrees represent a profound misunderstanding of power, or were they a desperate attempt to cling to it in a rapidly changing world? Maybe the answer is a bit of both. But one thing is certain: Elagabalus remains a fascinating, if not absurd, figure in the history of the Roman Empire. As you settle into the final chapter of Elagabalus's reign, It's hard not to wonder how the emperor managed to live in such a bubble of extravagant delusion, all while holding the fate of the Roman Empire in his hands. The contradictions in his rule are striking. Here was a man, thrust into the throne as a teenager, who saw himself as a living god, a figure not just above the law, but above the very order of society itself. And yet, it wasn't just his eccentricities that led to his downfall. It was the larger context of Rome's troubled empire, which was unraveling piece by piece under the strain of military upheaval, economic instability, and religious conflict. It was a time when emperors often didn't last long. Power was fickle, alliances shifted, and the emperor's personal whims could spell disaster for the state. When you look at the broader picture, the reign of Elagabalus becomes almost tragically inevitable. Despite his lavish reforms and the odd laws he enacted, such as, yes, his attempt to ban flatulence in public spaces, he alienated too many people. Elagabalus's unyielding attachment to his own brand of divine sovereignty, his unwillingness to conform to traditional Roman values, and his seemingly endless list of bizarre decrees made him a target for those eager to see him gone. But what's fascinating is how his assassination, his violent removal from power, was the final punctuation mark on a larger story of a society struggling to cope with its own decline. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's death was inevitable from the moment he began his odd reign, or whether there was a chance he could have been more successful had he moderated his eccentricities. Would Rome have accepted his religious reforms if he had been less insistent on personal divinity? Could his love of outrageous spectacle have been channeled into something more politically useful? Had he realized the importance of balancing his extravagant whims with practical governance? Perhaps, but as with many aspects of history, there's no way to know for sure. It's easy to look back with modern eyes and think of him as a symbol of everything that went wrong with imperial Rome, but, back then, many would have seen him as a prophet of sorts trying to craft his own reality in an empire spiraling out of control. Elagabalus's assassination in 222 CE wasn't just the end of his reign. It marked the beginning of another volatile period in Roman history. His murder was orchestrated by members of his own court, including his mother and the Praetorian Guard, and was likely an attempt to restore order and stability. He was replaced by his cousin, Severus Alexander, who would attempt to steer the empire in a more traditional direction. But Elagabalus's legacy, the messianic self-obsession, the ill-fated religious reforms, and, of course, the curious flatulence ban would remain, leaving an indelible mark on Roman history. Even his posthumous memory became a source of mockery and ridicule, cementing his place as one of the most bizarre figures to ever sit on the imperial throne. But for all the ridicule heaped upon him, there's a certain poignancy to the life of Elagabalus. He was, after all, a young man thrust into a position of immense power, surrounded by intrigue, expectation, and political maneuvering. His eccentricities may have seemed outrageous, but they were also a reflection of his own confusion and struggle to make sense of a world that seemed to be crumbling beneath him. Like many rulers before him, Elagabalus found himself caught between personal desires, religious fervor, and the complex realities of ruling one of the largest empires the world had ever known. Now, as you close the book on this chapter of history, it's worth considering just how many other emperors and figures in history have been shaped by similar forces, people whose reigns were defined by eccentric behavior, strange laws, and attempts to navigate power through unorthodox means. Elagabalus might be one of the more extreme examples, but he was by no means alone. History is filled with leaders whose reigns were marked by acts of absurdity and spectacle, often driven by the pressure of maintaining control in a world where nothing was certain. As the Roman Empire continued to stagger forward, it's fascinating to think about how Elagabalus's story might have been told differently, had things played out differently. Imagine if he had reigned during a more stable period, where his religious ideas could have been tested in less turbulent times. What if he had surrounded himself with more politically savvy advisors, people who could have helped him steer the empire through its many crises? Would he have been remembered as a visionary, an eccentric genius who pushed the boundaries of what was possible? Or would he have still been dismissed as a madman, a tragic figure whose self-destructive tendencies doomed him to failure? What's clear, however, is that Elagabalus's story remains one of history's great curiosities. He wasn't the first, and he certainly won't be the last, to try and bend the rules of governance to their will. His reign serves as a reminder that, even in the most powerful empires, the whims of one ruler can have profound and lasting effects on the course of history. And while the Roman Empire ultimately survived beyond his death, it never fully recovered from the turbulence of his reign. It's a reminder that, for all the power and grandeur, history often hinges on the fragile balance between eccentricity and pragmatism. And now, as the night deepens and the whispers of ancient Rome fade into the distance, perhaps it's time to turn off the lights and let the absurdity of it all slip away. After all, if we can take anything from Elagabalus's reign, it's that sometimes the most ridiculous things in history are the ones that leave the deepest marks. Maybe you'll dream of his strange laws tonight, or maybe not. Either way, sleep is a much safer place to ponder the limits of power.